What's up, Sanisa, Super Bad Estrada here, and I just want to give a huge special shout out to the relay. Thank you so much for all of the continuous support, and thank you for all of the support during and after and before every single fight.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news. Ow!
Okay, we'll start with this. Well, Rob Brant hopes the third fight with Ryota Murata takes place outside of Japan. He was quoted as saying, "I would prefer for it not to be in Japan, just because of the flight and the camp and everything. I don't think that portion of it is in the contract. That's something we can negotiate, which I leave up to Top Rank." It was a very wild experience, Brant recalled, especially to face someone with that level of fame in their home country and have the lights that bright. Metaphorically speaking, it was a huge event in Japan, so it was definitely a valuable experience to go through that. Obviously, it didn't go the way I wanted it to go, but I would say I definitely took a lot away from it as well. I knew he was a big star there, but I didn't know to what extent, where people were waiting at our hotel to take pictures and things like that. They had to usher people away from the hotel. He's a huge star over there, and I did not expect it to be at that level. It was a crazy experience. The Japanese fans are very devout fans. I think that I had the wrong game plan. That would be the biggest problem. I wanted to break the CompuBox record for punches thrown because I was 2 punches off the first time that I fought Murata. So I was like, I'm going to try to beat that record. I'm going to try to throw an extra 3 punches to get my name in the history books. But that's not always the wisest thing when someone's as hard of a puncher as Murata is. I want to say that both of those fights, the first Brant versus Murata fight and the second, were thoroughly entertaining fights. You know, Rob Brant really outworked Ryota Murata in their first outing. For every 1 punch that Murata threw, Rob must have thrown something like 3 or 4. A machine gun assault on the part of Rob Brant. In turn, in the second fight, Ryota Murata brought out the cannons and dispatched Rob Brant in just 2 rounds. I have no issues with seeing a third fight. I dare say that it might be necessary. You know, both guys won their respective bouts emphatically. There's no question that Rob Brant outworked and battered Ryota Murata in the first fight, and there's no question that Ryota Murata got Rob Brant the fuck out of there in the second fight. I could go for a third, though I don't see it happening, let alone outside of Japan the way that Rob wants it. I mean, outside of Japan, Ryota Murata's not a star, doesn't put as many asses in as many seats. And in boxing, you stage the fight where it stands to make the most money. Anybody looking to do anything with Ryota Murata, the incentive in fighting him is that he's such a big star in Japan. That's why it caught me off guard when they decided to stage the first fight here in America, when this guy already moves a lot of tickets in his own backyard. Why bring him here?
Yeah, I didn't really understand that.
Ultimately, Rob Brant feels that he has unfinished business with Ryota Murata, though I'm not sure that that feeling is mutual, that the Ryota Murata people could go for a third fight with Rob Brant.
Do they want to?
I think that given Ryota Murata's age, his celebrity, he's got bigger fish to fry.
It's time to step it up.
I don't know how receptive the Ryota Murata people would be to a third outing with Rob Brant. It's one of those situations where you don't want to fight the guy too many times, give him too many opportunities to figure you out, when the first time that you fought him, he did figure you out.
Yeah, they might pass on that one.
Ryota Murata, at this point, given his celebrity domestically, he can keep fighting guys like Steven Butler and keep putting asses in the seats once it's okay to start putting asses in the seats again. He can bide his time doing this long enough that, maybe he gets a Canelo fight, maybe he gets a Golovkin fight. In terms of domestic level celebrity, short of a Canelo Alvarez or a Gennady Golovkin, nobody's got a fan base like Ryota Murata's got a fan base. Not at 160 pounds and not at 168. Not a Jermall Charlo, not a Billy Joe Saunders, not a Callum Smith, a Demetrius Andrade. None of these guys have the kind of following that Ryota Murata has. It's for this reason that he could bide his time comfortably fighting guys like Steven Butler until a Canelo Alvarez or Gennady Golovkin fight becomes available to him. You fight Rob Brant for a third time, and you're running risks of derailing what's left of Ryota Murata's career. I don't see it happening. So where does that leave Rob Brant? What can he do? I'll tell you what he can do. He can see about getting himself a Demetrius Andre WBO title fight. That's what he can do. You know, Rob was in action late last month. He's coming off a win over Vitaly Kopylyanko. He's essentially back in the winner's bracket. He's rebounded. And for Rob, I think a Demetrius Andre fight makes sense. Rob Brant is one of the more solid fighters in the middleweight division, provided that Demetrius Andre makes it past Liam Williams, or if the Liam Williams fight falls apart, something happens, some unforeseen circumstance, I could go for Andre versus Brant. The bottom line here is, if I'm Rob Brant, I don't hold my breath waiting for the Murata people to give me another shot, another opportunity to derail their golden goose. If I'm Rob Brant, I start exploring what else the middleweight division has to offer. In light heavyweight news, a very interesting read per Hall of Fame promoter Bob Arum.
My matchmaker told me Joe Smith would beat Beterbiev. I thought Joe was tremendous. I always believed that he was a real good fighter that could be at the top tier of the light heavyweights, but he wasn't disciplined and he never came in with a game plan. Well, here, he had a game plan and he worked and he was disciplined and he's just so strong and he punches well. I'd make him competitive with any light heavyweight, including Beterbiev. I asked Brad Goodman, could he fight Beterbiev? And Goodman said he'd beat Beterbiev. I didn't know about that, but that's what Goodman said. That would be a tremendous fight. I could see both of them going down.
When asked about that same proposition that he could be facing Artur Beterbiev, what are his chances? Joe Smith Jr. himself had this to say. He says, I believe I'm a little tougher than Beterbiev. I'll get him out of there. He's quoted as saying, I think it's a great opportunity. I'm hoping that our promoters can make it happen, honestly. I think it'll be a great fight. I think our styles will make a great fight. But I believe I'm a little tougher than he is, and I'll get him out of there. I think somebody's gonna get knocked out, He's a huge puncher, so, anything can happen. I'm just waiting to hear the news, Smith said, regarding when he'll face the Salamov-Vlasov winner. I don't know exactly what's going to happen, but I feel like they should put the title on the line for this fight. I fought the two best guys that were in the tournament, Alvarez and Jesse Hart, and destroyed the both of them. Now, we don't know when these two other guys are going to be able to fight, or if they're even going to be able to. I've addressed such a proposition before, though when I addressed it, it was post-fight, after Joe Smith Jr. annihilated Eleider Alvarez. I was, and still am, of the opinion that the WBO in this situation could so opt to elevate Joe Smith Jr. to full-fledged champion given the circumstances and simply make the winner of Salamov versus Vlasov the mandatory challenger to the WBO title. That way, those two guys don't lose anything. The winner of the fight still gets a world title opportunity, but in the in-between time, let's see if we can't move things along so that a unification match can happen. The sooner a WBO champion is crowned, the sooner that champion can take on Artur Beterbiev. Much of the conversation in reference to Artur has been about when is he going to fight Dmitry Bivol? When are those two guys going to lock horns? When are they going to unify? And little by little, Joe Smith Jr. has crept into the picture. And here today, I dare say, Brad Goodman's onto something. He really is. Artur Beterbiev is a skilled operator, a quality operator. Make no mistake. But he's a artillery guy. If he's anything, he's that. He's an offense guy. Come forward guy, aggressive guy, pressure guy. The kind of guy that, he can be caught between the punches because he's going to open up. He's going to come after you. We've already seen a very skilled operator in Alexander Vozdik attempt to box around the aggressive approach of Artur Beterbiev, and Alexander faltered. Well, Joe Smith Jr. doesn't have Alexander Vozdik approach. He's not a finesse fighter the way that guy is. Put simply, Joe Smith Jr. and Artur Beterbiev are cut from the same cloth. Granted that one of these fighters is a more well-schooled, more well-versed fighter than the other. That same fighter happens to be 5 years older than the other fighter. Joe Smith Jr. is 30, Artur Beterbiev is 35. Right now he's got broken ribs. That's going to put him out of commission for at least a little while. When he returns, maybe he has that Daniev fight, or maybe he takes care of his mandatory challenger, Meng Fang Long, putting a unification match at least 1 to 2 fights from now. It's possible that before Artur Beterbiev shoots for yet another world title in this weight class, he could very well be 36 years old. The clock is ticking, and time, as it were, is on Joe Smith Jr.'s side by at least 4 or 5 years. Joe Smith Jr., who has shown improvement fight by fight. He showed improvement in the Jesse Hart fight and showed even more improvement against a more seasoned fighter at this weight in Eleider Alvarez. As crazy as this might sound, Joe Smith Jr. stands more than just a fighting chance against Artur Beterbiev. Lest we forget what happened in the Callum Johnson fight. Callum Johnson, who's a come-forward bruiser, the way that Joe Smith Jr. is a come-forward bruiser. Callum almost got Artur out of there. He dropped that guy. He did.
That wasn't even the first time that Artur Beterbiev hit the deck. He was also dropped by Jeff Page
a few years before that, in 2014. Perhaps the best way to go about dealing with Artur Beterbiev is to fight fire with fire, and that takes a unique physical specimen. Your body's got to be up for it, but that's what Joe Smith Jr. is. A good physical specimen, a durable fighter with a big punch who is improving.
We've spent all this time speculating over what would happen if Artur Beterbiev ever met Dmitry Bivol, that perhaps it won't even happen that way. Perhaps it will be Joe Smith Jr. that Artur Beterbiev locks horns with in his very next unification match. In any event, I look forward to it, and I reiterate, Joe stands more than just a fighting chance against Artur. I think if Joe Smith Jr. has proved anything over the years, is that he can't be overlooked. He is a dark horse in this division.
And finally, Frank Warren had this to say. He says he's not holding his breath for Eddie Hearn collaboration. He was quoted as saying, "We're competitive, but so are Sky and so are BT. So are ITV and so are BBC. So are Virgin Atlantic and so are BA. So are Rainier and so are EasyJet." Warren told Boxing News. That's the world. Grow up, everybody. What do you think this is? We're rivals in a small market, but we're no different to any other industry. Look at football clubs, the way they fight over players and so forth. What's different? Sometimes I find it quite pathetic. People even think that way. What do they think we're going to do? All hold hands there and have some crumpets and tea cakes? It's not like that. We're rivals in a very competitive industry. I won't keep chasing people, Warren said of his recent olive branch to Hearn. I put it out there. I picked up the phone. I initiated the conversation. He called me back. We exchanged a couple of brief emails. I want to get this meeting on, but I'm not sitting around waiting for it to happen. I want it to happen. I can't do any more than that. There's willing on Queensberry's side to make some of these fights. The only ones that have appeared on my shows have when we've won purse bids, like Lee Selby, like Kid Galahad, like John Ryder, Warren said. In truth, while Frank Warren says he's not holding his breath for this to happen, anybody in the know, anybody who understands the relationship here, or the lack thereof, wasn't holding their breath either. Look, the bottom line here is, in order for this to work out, Frank Warren has to be able to provide for matchroom fighters that cross over the same kind of paydays that they would have got had they stayed on their side of the street. And Frank Warren can't do that.
And we're not talking about your Lee Selbys, your John Ryders, or your Kid Galahads. We're talking about your Dillian Whites. You know, the name of Dillian White has been in Frank Warren's mouth quite a bit as of late, because he means to match Daniel Dubois against him, rather the winner of Dubois versus Joyce. But in all actuality, that's a fight that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. If Dillian White comes through this Alexander Povetkin rematch and reclaims his title shot, what need would he have of either Daniel Dubois or Joe Joyce? What's he got to prove to them?
Nothing.
How would this relationship work? What fighters from what stable would fight on what platform against whose fighters? Would the Matchroom kids benefit? Would they even benefit from crossing over to Queensberry for a one-off to fight on BT Sport? Do they benefit from that, or does Frank Warren benefit from that? Benefit in the sense that it gives him more content to provide that platform, whereas Matchroom doesn't have that problem, doesn't face that issue.
Try and understand, without condoning, without condemning, that the way this works out, yeah, Frank Warren could benefit from such a relationship, but for Eddie Hearn, it's rather inconsequential and I dare say unnecessary.
I think that for certain of these fighters, perhaps a bartering process could be negotiated. You know, maybe you say, okay, send us your guy Anthony Yard so he can fight our guy Joshua Buatsi, and in turn, we'll send our guy Alen Babic to fight your guy Nathan Gorman.
Something like that.
And it sounds good, right? Makes sense. It's just that, well, in order for Eddie Hearn to get Alen Babic, his undefeated heavyweight prospect, a fight with the likes of a Nathan Gorman, you've got a more popular guy on your side of the street in Dave Allen. Hell, for sending him over there to fight Nathan Gorman, you might as well let him fight Tom Little on your side of the street, making sending Alen Babic over there to Queensbury a redundancy. What are you doing that for? I mean, maybe it makes a bit of sense, maybe, but it makes more sense for Frank than it does for Eddie. And that is the fundamental problem. Who gets what fights, and are those fights even necessary, depending on who we're talking about? Don't confuse this for the Crawford versus Spence conversation, a bona fide super fight between two of the more prominent welterweights in the division that the fans are actually asking for. Any fights going down between Eddie and Frank aren't on the scale of that fight, and if Eddie were to enter into this partnership, it'd have to be as a favor to Frank more than anything else, because Eddie doesn't need him. As a boxing fan, I'm not against bipartisanship. I'm not against this proposition. I'm not against Eddie Hearn and Frank Warren working together to put together certain fights. It's just that I know how this works, and I know who stands to benefit the most from it. Frank does. And Eddie Hearn is not in the business of looking out for Frank Warren's best interests. He's in the business of looking out for Matchroom and Sky Sports' best interests. DAZN, in this part of the world, I think what it really is that, Frank Warren doesn't have a lot of major players at these weights. So he's got a couple of good heavyweight prospects. He's still got some affiliation with Tyson Fury, though I've said this many times. These days, Tyson Fury is more of a top-ranked U.S.-based fighter than he is a Queensbury Promotions UK-based fighter. I mean, his next fight ain't going down in the United Kingdom, right?
Right.
But aside from a couple of promising, unbeaten heavyweight prospects who don't have the marquee value of a Dillian White, by the way, that aside, what else have you got? Archie Sharp? Anthony Yard? I mean, it seems to me that the one who stands to benefit the most from this proposed partnership really is Frank more than Eddie. For Eddie, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I think that the sport of boxing needs promotional outfits to work together to make big fights happen. Emphasis on big fights, to make big fights happen. The problem here is these proposed matches aren't big fights. It seems like what you want is for Eddie Hearn to help you stay afloat.